Hello and welcome to Helicopter Training Videos. In this video, we're going to look at dangerous student errors during Vortex Ring State. This is a clip from the Helicopter Training Videos podcast Dangerous Student Errors series. You can find those full episodes linked in the description or in the YouTube podcast tab.
Let's talk about VRS.
Okay, so Vortex Ring State, and in the past it has been known as settling with power. There's a whole side conversation about how that ended up where it is, but Vortex Ring State, sometimes known as settling with power. This maneuver had what we call a traditional recovery to it, which was once we get into Vortex Ring State, or the first symptoms of Vortex Ring State, where the aircraft's settling and we've got an accelerated descent rate, or maybe the first symptoms might be shudders, unusual shudders, aircraft yawing or rolling, or the feeling of dropping out. We would traditionally lower the collective a little bit and simultaneously push the nose forward. And then as soon as we have the airspeed come alive, or the trim strings come up if they'd fallen down, we are now out of the recirculation. We start raising power, pulling up collective and climb away from the ground. And that has worked pretty well, except the problem is it usually can take 100 to 200 feet or more, depending on the descent rate that built. So the main guidance was, okay, here's how we get out of this if we get into it. But the really important thing is we don't get into it. We have to work on identifying the situations and the symptoms and not get into it in the first place. And then relatively recently, the Vuichard technique became very popular. And at one point, Robinson were saying, hey, did you guys know about this fantastic maneuver to get out of Vortex Ring State that can get us out in much less time, maybe 40, 50 feet? And I would say it can. That is true. It is an excellent way to get out of Vortex Ring State very quickly. The problem has been in people trying to work this out for themselves and thinking that we could go much further because you have this great easy way to just slide out. And we'll talk a little bit more when we get into that version about why that's been a problem. But first of all, let's talk about the traditional technique in recovery and the things to be thinking about as an instructor here. First of all, if you work with a student who has been trained on both, we have to make sure we're very clear about what technique we're using when we get into it. So that's important to brief. Hey, I realize you've been trained on both techniques today. Let's start with the traditional technique. Remind me how that works, or vice versa. The other thing is, no matter which version, is we don't let the aircraft stay in Vortex Ring State beyond the first symptoms only. I have to admit, I did, as previously, as part of the experience with new hires, we'd go through all the training and then we'd say, okay, now let me just show you a little bit further in to give you confidence about how good this is to get out. I had experiences with the aircraft maneuvering in a way that it shouldn't, and seeing the accidents that happen and the way that Robinson had reacted to it. We don't do that anymore. No more. It's just not safe to mess with this. So the first symptoms, whatever that is, that's your cue. Get out. Don't go any further than that. The other thing is, it is possible that as the aircraft is buffeted by the recirculation, that the nose may drop quite aggressively, and that will depend on many factors, and certain airframes are more susceptible to it than others. But if that nose does drop, we must fight the urge to come hard back with the cyclic. Was an accident we can have a look at in a second, where unfortunately that was the response of the pilot and they chopped the tail boom off. So we need to brief that we're not going to do that. We need to brief, and we need to also guard as the instructor close on the back of the cyclic to not let the student come off cyclic there. One more piece I would say is, there's two ways to get into Vortex Ring State typically. One is to come to an out of ground effect hover. The scenario might be that we're doing some sort of aerial photography work, and the client wants to bring it to a hover so we can get a nice stabilized shot, or slow it down so we get the piece we need. And we're not paying attention. The aircraft's settling. That's one way to get in. The other way is a steep descent into an approach where we have a descent rate of, say, 500-600 feet per minute, and we just keep slowing down to make our spot, and we're not arresting the descent. We're not following that rule of below 30 knots, we must have no more than 300 feet per minute. If we ignore that, then we can get ourselves into it in a steep approach. I think that's important to make sure we train on both of those. For most check rides, it's going to be an out of ground effect hover probably, but from a safe altitude, 1,500 feet, show what this looks like to have a descent rate in, and we're bringing the nose up to try and hit our imaginary spot 1,500 feet beneath us, and we're getting slower and slower, but we let the descent rate stay high. Now, if we were to try to control that descent, we have all three pieces all come straight together. We've got now descent rate, low airspeed, and pulling power. We get straight into it. So it's important to safely show both of those. But if we are doing the out of ground effect hover version of this, we need to make sure that as we bring the nose up and the airspeed decays, that we don't go too far with that and start flying backwards. You have no real reference at 1,500 feet above the ground. It is very hard to see if the aircraft is moving backwards. And what will happen is as the airspeed starts to pick up, you've got no indications on the indicated airspeed because your pitot tube doesn't face backwards. And all of a sudden, the aircraft's vertical fin is going to kick into effect and spin the aircraft around on you. So weathercocking around. So we need to make sure we're careful of that. But let's talk about some more specifics of the traditional recovery. We want the student, when it gets to the recovery point of the traditional Vortex Ring State recovery, to lower the collective and bring the nose forward. But we want to make sure that they don't over pitch. If we bring the nose too far forward and we end up pointing straight at the ground, one of the things that may happen is that we get a big build of airspeed and then they come off cyclic, and then we get a potential overspeed where we transfer all of that energy into the rotor system and the engine just cannot back off enough to control that. So don't let the nose go too far. It's also not a good recovery technique because you're lawn darting this thing down. You're losing altitude. You're not making a very effective recovery. We just need to get out of our recirculation. The other thing to watch out for is the collective. We want to make sure that the student doesn't inadvertently raise the collective instead of lowering it, because that's just going to exacerbate the vortex ring state. But also, if they do lower the collective, which they should, we want to make sure they don't lower too much. If they do lower too much, we end up putting the aircraft into an autorotative state, and now the airflow coming up with the collective all the way down may lead for the rotor to break away and cause a rotor overspeed, or to drag the engine up with it and cause an engine overspeed with the governor not being able to back off quick enough. The auto rotation is a technique to get out of vortex ring state. It just has to be something we decide to do, not something that happens when we're trying to do something else, which kind of goes into another thing we see sometimes with a vortex ring state recovery, is that a student can get a little bit tense about this maneuver and they reach out, their brain reaches out to grab something and they grab the wrong thing in terms of the recovery technique. And we've had people try to roll the throttle on. We've had people try to enter an auto. If they try to roll the throttle on, the instructor should have their hand right there with the throttle and say, nope, my controls. And we'll have a discussion in a minute once we get out of this. If they enter the auto, again, the instructor should be right there. But I would say if they try to enter the auto, I would say my controls, and I would enter the auto, and I would fly the aircraft out of the vortex ring state in an auto rotation. I wouldn't try and fight the controls back up and trying to bring the throttle back up. And all this time we're descending. I think that's going to just get us into a really accelerated vortex ring state. I think it's better take the controls, go with the auto rotation. You have 1,500 feet. You have plenty of time. Once you are stable in the auto, just make sure that you have airspeed before you try to get back out of it. Otherwise, you're going in a zero speed auto rotation, probably about 1,400 feet per minute. As soon as you bring the power back in and try to climb out of that, you'll instantly get into an accelerated vortex ring state. So you have to make sure we accelerate forward and fly this thing beyond ETL. And then if the other thing is that once they've got the aircraft moving forward and they've done the first part, they've lowered the collective, they push forward, they see the airspeed come alive, and now they're raising the collective, we have to make sure, like in many of these maneuvers, that they don't overpitch, that they don't just pull, and now we droop the RPMs. So we need to make sure that we're watching the manifold pressure, but also go back to the idea of the instructor knowing roughly where the collective should go and where it shouldn't go, and blocking it if it comes up too much. So that's a lot just for the traditional recovery.
Well, let me jump in and ask one thing about the
Yeah.
traditional recovery. I still remember a few years ago, it wasn't all that long ago, that I did my private add-on. That the very first time an instructor demonstrated this to me, he was saying to recover, go forward on the cyclic, then back on the cyclic, and then go forward on the cyclic. And we ended up in a fairly sustained descent, which I found rather disconcerting. And in fact, I don't ever remember any subsequent demonstration that was that disconcerting. Talk about the recovery. Is that proper forward, backward, forward on the cyclic, or is it really just a matter of degree?
I can see where that might have come about. So we push forward initially to get some airspeed and get out of the recirculation.
Yep.
Then it may have been that there was too much nose forward, and we need to transfer some of that airspeed into climb. Then why it went forward again, I'm not 100% sure.
Okay, so that doesn't
Yeah.
sound like the normal way to do the recovery then, this 3 moves on the cyclic.
I would have to really pay attention next time I do it, but I think we just generally push forward for airspeed. Once we have airspeed, we raise the collective. That tends to bring the nose up by itself.
Yeah.
And then we're just trying to stop the descent. So it's not even as though you're pitching necessarily immediately for 53 or 55 for the best climb. We just want to transfer some of that. One thing you have to remember is when you push the nose forward, the attitude does not give instantaneous airspeed. So we have this attitude, and the airspeed is going to start building, and maybe it goes beyond where we wanted it to be. So we make the adjustment, and maybe that was a counter adjustment too much and back. I'm not 100% sure, but that's not some way that I would be teaching it necessarily. But.
Glad to hear that, because the explanation didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, and it still stuck with me a few years later, kind of thinking about, all right, why was that very first experience with VRS so disconcerting? And then from a recovery standpoint, after you've entered it, where do you coach people in terms of when do you start the recovery? Are you looking at essentially a decrease in vertical speed, or what kind of is the clue that says, here's where we initiate the recovery?
Well, when we start the recovery, I start the recovery, or ask the student to start the recovery once we have the first symptom. So if that is an accelerated descent rate, or your stomach will tell you, get this real kind of horrible feeling, or the aircraft starts moving on its own, your pitch roll, you can get some pretty intense shudders. Any of that would be first clue. We need to fix this and get out of it. And that's when we start pitching forward. And then what we would be looking for recovered, when we've actually recovered, is we would be looking for the altimeter to have stopped spinning down. The VSI, I think we talked about this on the last one, there's a 5-6 second delay in the VSI. So we can't trust that as we can't trust it to know exactly what a descent rate is if it's accelerating. We just have to go kind of with the feel. They say there's 3 things to get into Vortex Ring State. So less than ETL, power applied more than 20%, or essentially powered flight and auto rotation, and greater than 300 feet per minute. Each airframe, the weight, the density, altitude, all those things play into where that number actually is. But 300 is a great sort of safety margin to say, hey, let's not go beyond this in this configuration. But what I do see sometimes is a student will set up for an out of ground effect hover. We come down at 350 feet and they say, okay, I'm recovering. That's not the first indication of Vortex Ring State. You've given me the pieces that could lead to Vortex Ring State, but a part of the training that's important, I think, is to see or feel a first indication. I know in the fixed wing world, the whole how far you go with stalls has changed, and there's probably arguments back and forth about first indications versus developed, and that's a whole side conversation. But I think it's important to, as the check ride requires, as the training requires, see the first indication, identify it, and then start the recovery.
Okay, good. Now I think you wanted to move on and talk about Vuichard recovery issues.
Yeah, so Vuichard, or sometimes called the lateral recovery, the main, if you listeners are not aware of it, the main way we're going to do this is we set up everything else the same. We identify the first indication, and then we raise collective, which is completely against everything else you've heard about traditional recovery, but simultaneously we hold the heading with the left pedal. So we apply left pedal if we need to hold heading, and then we use right cyclic about 15 degrees of bank to the right in a American style rotor system to slide out to the right. There's a few pieces there to think about. The tail rotor thrust is what's helping us be pushed to the right, where the controls may be unresponsive or mushy if we're in fully developed vortex ring state. So that's why we tend to go to the right. If we were to go to the left, I'm not saying it can't be done, but if you do go to the left, you are fighting against the natural tendency of the rotor system tail rotor to push you to the right. So when we slide out to the right, there's already a few pieces that can go wrong here. One is they can overpull the collective, and then we get RPM droop, which increases the descent rate, reduces the tail rotor thrust and the main rotor thrust, which is not helpful with us trying to have controllability to get out. The other one is they can delay the sequence. So instead of doing it all simultaneously, they can raise the collective and are slow on the other pieces, which can lead to an accelerated descent rate. It can also lead to the aircraft yawing if they're not putting in the left pedal as they increase the power. So we need to be close on the pedals. This is one maneuver where I might considering almost like a left foot brace, where I hold my left foot very close and I lock my left foot so that if they push the right pedal by mistake, that they can't get very far before I sense that and then push through on the left. Because if they push right pedal whilst raising collective, we're going to start spinning the helicopter whilst descending 1,000 feet per minute or whatever it gets to at that point. That's not a great place to be either. The other thing is with the cyclic, if the student overbanks and goes way beyond 15 degrees of bank, it's not a very effective recovery because we come out with a lot less vertical component of lift. So when we do get out, we're sort of already behind the aircraft a little bit in terms of maximizing the vertical thrust. And then the other piece is how long do we stay in that right drift? When you go up to 1,500 feet, which is, I'm not saying we should ever do anything lower than this. This is a safe place to do it. But when we do these maneuvers, the vortex ring state recovery at 1,500 feet, it is very, very hard to sense any amount of movement. So two things. One, if you have access to it, go do this stuff in a simulator so we can really work on what it would really be like close to the ground. And you'll see it brings in a whole new perspective, literally, when you are only 150 feet off the ground, desperately trying to stop this thing from hitting the ground. We talked a little bit about the traditional method and using, how much forward cyclic. Well, you're going to have to do what you do to not hit the ground. So if you are trying to pitch for 53, but you're going to hit the ground, you will bring the nose up and you'll sacrifice airspeed. You won't know that at 1,500 feet. So it's really good if you can get into the simulator to try this. But with the Vuichard or lateral recovery, to do it in the aircraft, what I do is I take people, I found this has worked for me training people on this, is before we go up at altitude, I bring them over one of our helipads, and there's a circle around the helipad that's probably about 30 or so feet around. So a little bit bigger than the R-22's main rotor and about the same as they are, pretty close to the R-44. And I bring us to a hover and I say, imagine that circle on the ground is the recirculation all the way around the disk of vortex ring state. And all we need to do is get the edge of the right side of the disk out of the inside where it's coming down to hit the outside of the circulation where it's going up. It only takes about 5-10 feet to the right for the R-22 or R-44. So now that we know what we're aiming for, we can do it. We can basically just raise the collective left pedal right cyclic and drift off. And as I'm doing that, I'm working on a few things with the student. I'm sort of seeing, do they have the coordination? Do they have the bank angle about right? But also we count. We say, okay, we start the maneuver recovery now, 1,000, 2,000, we're out. So now we have a new way to measure roughly how far we need to go so that when we go up to 1,500 feet, we use the same. We bank as we raise collective left pedal right cyclic, 1,000, 2,000, we're out. And then we can expedite the rest of the recovery instead of staying in this prolonged right drift. And the problem with that is, A, you're not doing the best thing you can to necessarily climb away, because although you may be out of the recirculation, you may not have the best performance to actually climb out with this sideways drift. But the other more dangerous part of it is, as you're building up speed to the right, the indicated airspeed again is useless. You'll have no idea. You just see the trim strings are off to one side, and you're building up speed without realizing it, with no close ground reference, and all of a sudden the aircraft will snap round to the right as the vertical stabilizer digs in, and we come around for a hard right, which is usually followed by a hard left pedal. And we've talked about this before, all the problems that can go with drooping RPM or overspeeds and things like that. So we don't want to be staying in that for long. So that's one technique I recommend, is to use a pad and just work, maybe a 5-foot hover, just work on this kind of the basics of it. The other thing is, as the instructor, just don't let it go on for that long. You know roughly how long it should be. And now we have to decide, okay, we've got out. We have two choices now. We either move the helicopter forward, or we can actually take the momentum to the right and carefully turn the aircraft in the direction of travel. Instead of fighting the momentum, we can go with it, turn the aircraft into trim, and that's a quicker way to get an efficient climb away. Now, if you have terrain or trees and things like that, you won't better do that. You'll have to come right, get out, and now try to push forward. But you'll see there's a lot more pedal work with the aircraft trying to fight you on that, and there's also time. You'll see the altimeter is not really showing any kind of climb effect for significantly longer trying to do that. So again, we train on both methods. We put them in scenarios in the simulator where they have to consider both ways of finishing that Vuichard recovery. But yeah, the accident that we sort of talked about a little bit was there was a few, but this one in particular was a Bow 429. It was an in-flight breakup while training on Vortex Ring State. So again, this is a training accident with a pretty capable aircraft and pretty experienced crew. The instructor pilot was nearly 3,000 hours, and the trainee, I think he had 6,000 hours and about 2,500 in helicopters. So they both had pretty good experience. And they had a flight earlier in the morning where the trainee had said that he was a little bit concerned that the instructor had let a very high descent rate build, and that the instructor pilot hadn't intervened, and it had gone beyond the tolerance of the trainee. And he said, we're gonna start the recovery here. On the accident flight itself, there was a data recorder that recorded over 1,700 feet per minute. So they were certainly not going to first indications. They were getting into this accelerated vortex ring state. And the control inputs were recorded, and they did a traditional recovery, but there were very big abrupt control inputs, including forward cyclic by nearly full aft cyclic in 1 second. So he's got forward and then to the stops, essentially aft cyclic. At the same time, the collective is going down with an increasing left pedal input. They turned around about 300 degrees. This aircraft's out of control, and the student comes back almost to the stops, chops the tail off, and unfortunately that was a fatal accident. And like I said, there's been a couple of others that have been suspected to be either one of these two techniques. They've let it get a little bit too far. There's ADS-B data showing what they were doing. So Robinson, well, actually a few manufacturers sort of chipped in on this. Robinson updated their safety notice. I'll just read out real quick the piece. A recovery should be initiated as soon as vortex ring state is suspected. Early recognition and immediate recovery by moving the rotor out of its own downwash is essential. Large control inputs are not necessary and should be avoided. The other thing that was telling was Airbus put out a notice saying that vortex ring state is not a normal part of the flight domain. The dynamic loads have not been, basically the aircraft wasn't tested for this kind of thing where we're coming down 1,000, 1,500 feet per minute and all of a sudden we snap it out using the Vuichard or whatever technique you use. You get a lot of potential damage to drive systems and engine mounts and all sorts of things. So I think, circling all the way back, I think both techniques are great. It's the training that has been causing problems here. So we need to pay attention to the first indications and not mess around with this.
Yeah, my big takeaway from that was what you just said, first indication and then recover. Don't go into a joyride and go, yeah, let's just ride this down for a while and then jump out of it. That's where you're saying a lot of the danger lies.
Yeah, and like I said before, I have been guilty of this in the past, and I'm thankful that nothing serious happened, although I did get some uncommanded scary stuff in the helicopter, and that's part of the reason why we won't do that anymore. It's too dangerous to mess around with, for sure. The benefit to the student or the instructor is far outweighed by the danger with this. So,
right. Okay, good.
This clip was just a small taste of the 3-part Dangerous Student Errors series on the Helicopter Training Podcast. In that series, we break down key instructor techniques like guarding and blocking controls, ghosting maneuvers, when to take the controls, and how to respond when a student freezes up. We then apply those concepts across real training scenarios, including slopes, hover work, running landings, quick stops, Vortex Ring State, auto rotations, simulated engine failures, off-airport operations, and more. We also review real maneuver-specific accidents and what we can learn from them as instructors and as students. You can find the full episodes right here on this YouTube channel under the podcast tab, or search for Helicopter Training Podcast on your favorite podcast player. And if you're interested in learning to fly helicopters, you can start learning right now on Helicopter Training Video's YouTube channel, with video playlists covering things like ground school subjects, flight maneuvers, as well as following along with a student on every training flight from day one all the way through to check ride. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to get all the latest videos and help support this channel. And finally, for more information, including articles, quizzes, and resources, and how to support this volunteer project, please check out our website, helicoptertrainingvideos.com. Thanks for watching. Fly safe.